a lot of debate today is how language use is changing as a result of the different technologies that we have developed and are developing for communication. So we're going to take a look at how the use of mobile technologies, so different types of hardware, and social media, so different channels, is changing how we actually use our language. And this is an area that we don't have any answers in at this point in time. We just have lots of questions. And so it's the questions that are really the most important thing in this session. And in this session, I'm going to be directing you to a lot of different TED Talks, because there's some great TED Talks on this topic. And these are coming from people who are far more expert in the topic than I am. So my goal with this session is just to frame some questions for you and then direct you to some interesting discussions around these questions. In this session, we'll first take a look at how mobile technologies are impacting language use. Then we'll take a look at how social media is impacting language use. And finally, we'll take a look at how technology is impacting communication across language barriers. So when we're looking at mobile technologies, there's two ways that we need to categorize what's being developed. So on the one hand, we have the hardware. So these are things like our tablets and our iPhones and our iPads and things like that. So the hardware that's being developed for communication purposes. And then within that the combination of hardware and software, we have the different functionalities that are being developed. So way back when, the only functionality we used to have with our telecommunications hardware was transmitting voice. While actually going back even further, we could only transmit code via telegraph. And then that moved on to being able to transmit voice. And now today we've got a lot of different functionalities in terms of the data or the information that we can transfer. So we've still got voice, but we've got texting, we've got emailing, we can send recorded audio versus live audio, we can send recorded video versus live video, we can send photographs and images and so on. So functionality is also changing along with the hardware that's being developed. And what gives us the functionality is the software. So this is just a really good way to sort of organize what's going on in terms of the technologies that are being developed, and that is look at the hardware and look at the functionalities that are provided by the different software that's being developed. Perhaps the biggest debate around mobile technologies and language use is centered around texting or any other shortened version of a written communication. So for example, chatting, messaging, and so on. So academics are really debating and taking a look at how our language use is changing as a result of having these very short and very rapidly communicated written messages going back and forth. And those who are on the side of trying to keep language the same, they're basically up in arms saying that texting and messaging are ruining our use of the written language. But then on the other hand, there are people who say, you know what, we still retain our ability to use a standard written language. All we're doing is we're basically creating a new version of the written language to use with these particular communication technologies. So it's not that we're losing our ability to create or use good written language. What we're doing is we're adding another version of written language to our entire repertoire. So those are the two sides of the debate. Take a look at your handout and for the link to a really great TED Talk that looks at this whole issue of whether texting or how texting is affecting our language use. You can do a little bit of a study yourself in terms of texting and language use just to see how much your personal use of language use has changed as a result of texting and messaging. So just take a look at something that you would normally write in standard written language, and then take a look at what you text and see if you can notice patterns of changes and patterns of differences between the two. And different people have differing degrees of variation between their written language and how they text and message. I'm an example of someone who doesn't actually have a lot of difference between how I would normally write something in a letter or a document, for example, versus texting. And people make fun of me about this all the time because my texts don't use any of the short forms and things like that. I don't really take advantage of this short, fast type of communication by making my messages shorter and putting abbreviations in. And then on the other side, there are people who have a lot of variation between their standard written language and their texting language. In their texting language, they use all of the abbreviations available and really make their messages really, really short. So take a look at your own use of standard written language versus texting and messaging language and see how much variation you personally have between the two. There's one other fun thing you can do with this whole debate about texting and language use, and that is to imagine that you have to explain texting to someone who's never used it before. And I call this the grandparent's guide to texting exercise. So imagine you've got your grandparents there and you have to explain to them how to text and how to change their written language as they text. So think about what, is there any new vocabulary they need to know? What are the abbreviations they need to know? Are there any other rules of use that your grandparents would need to know in this grandparent's guide to texting? This will help you uncover some of the patterns that academics and researchers are finding in our use of language when we text. And this actually supports the hypothesis that with texting, we're actually just creating another variation on the language. We're not actually losing the standard language. Technology doesn't just provide us with new hardware and new functionality for our communication. It's also providing us with new channels for communication. And this is what social media is. So social media is a set of ways that we can communicate with each other, and each channel has different strengths and different weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages, and so on. So in addition to hardware and functionality, we've also got these different channels developing for our communication. And these channels, researchers are arguing, are also changing how we use language. Within the larger category of social media, we've got smaller subcategories because different kinds of social media have been developed for different purposes and for different types of communication. Perhaps the most well-known subcategory of social media is social networking sites. So these are sites or types of social media that allow us just to connect with a lot of people, to stay in touch with our friends, meet new friends, and so on. And the most well-known example of this would be Facebook. Another well-known example is LinkedIn. Then another type of social media site is called a bookmarking site. This is a site that just allows us to flag different websites and locations that are of interest to us. Perhaps the most well-known one here is Pinterest. Then we've got social news. So a social media site just provides a continuous stream of news items that might be of interest to different readers. So an example of this is Reddit. Then we've got blogging. So blogging is kind of like an online diary or online journal that allows someone just to do stream of consciousness or specific topics of interest and send it out to the world. And then we've got microblogging. So microblogging are very, very short snippets of information or short thoughts that once again we put out there. A very powerful one is image sharing. And so for example, YouTube, any type of photograph sharing site, these are different ways of sharing video and images. That's a really important one. I can't believe I almost forgot that. So these are the categories of social media. So the next question is, how do these different types of social media change how we use language? The debate about social media and language use is fairly similar to the debate we see about texting and language use. So researchers are looking at how our written use of the language is changing with social media, because a lot of these social media channels really require very abbreviated written use of the language. So Twitter, for example, has all sorts of hashtag this, hashtag that, and different codes and different abbreviations. On Facebook, we tend to use a lot of abbreviations as well. So the debate about social media use is very similar to the debate about texting use. But there are a couple of other debates out there as well with social media and language use. The first one is about how our language use is changing because we're using more and more images as a communication tool. So with things like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and so on, we're using images, both static and moving, to communicate more than we ever have. and how is this changing our use of both the spoken language and the written language. A final area of research when it comes to social media and language use is the impact of blogging. Blogging is a social media that allows an everyday person to put his or her opinions out there into the world for anyone to find if they want to. And blogging is kind of changing access to the general public, because access to the general public used to just be limited to established writers and publishers and editors of newspapers, magazines, and books, and so on. But blogging allows people to kind of circumvent that. And so blogging is really allowing everyday people to get their voices heard by a much wider audience. And this in turn changes language use, because language that's going to the general public is no longer controlled by editors and so on. There's a great a great TED Talk on the influence of blogging on one particular society, and the society that this speaker is talking about is China. So this is a really interesting example of how blogging is changing both language use and how people communicate. So take a look at that particular TED Talk on blogging and language use. So we've looked at how hardware and functionality is changing language use with a specific focus on texting, and then we've looked at social media and language use with a focus on shortened versions similar to texting, the use of images, and the use of blogging. And there is one final area to consider when it comes to technologies and language use, and that is the impact that technology is having on how we communicate across language barriers. So technology is having a really interesting impact on two areas. One is translation, and the other is language learning. So technology is facilitating translation. If you've ever tried to use any of the internet-based translation tools, you'll realize they still have a long way to go. You get some very interesting and, quite frankly, amusing translations when you click that translation button on these provided by these different sites. However, very, very basic language translation is being covered by technology now, and it's the more nuanced and refined elements of translation that technology still can't handle. But it's an area to keep an eye on, because these translation tools are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're producing better and better translations. So technology is definitely impacting the world of translation. The other area that technology is impacting is the area of learning a language. So rather than relying on someone to translate the language, we're learning the language ourselves. And technology is significantly impacting how we learn language as well, because it's providing a lot of technology-based tools to help us acquire a language more effectively and more efficiently. There's a great TED Talk that kind of combines these two changes, the changes with translation and also the changes with language learning. And this is a TED Talk that looks at the use of massive online translation as a way both to bridge those language barriers and also to facilitate people learning a language. So have a look at this TED Talk to get an idea of some of the changes that technology is bringing both to translation and to language learning. In this session, we took a brief look at what is happening with language use because of all of the rapid changes in technologies that we've got going on. So we looked at how changes in hardware and functionality are impacting language use, specifically with texting. We looked at how social media is impacting language use. And finally, we looked at how technology is impacting translation and language learning as we bridge the language differences. This is an area, the whole area of language and technology is a really interesting area, and it's an area in which there is enormous change going on, literally on a daily basis. So I really recommend that this is an area that you stay focused on and you check in with once in a while just to see what's happening, what are the researchers saying about language use and technology.